In the summer of 1349, a man named Roger the Raker stopped coming to work. This would not have been remarkable, except that Roger's job was to empty the cesspits of London, and Roger was not sick. Roger was not dead. Roger had simply looked at the city around him, the bodies in the streets, the carts groaning under the weight of the not yet buried, the rivers that had long since stopped pretending to be rivers. And he had walked away. He left London on foot, headed north, and was never recorded again. The thing that should genuinely disturb you about that story is not that Roger abandoned his post. The thing that should disturb you is what happened to the cesspits after he left. Because in 1349, London had roughly 70,000 people, and every single one of them was still producing waste at the standard human rate of roughly 150 grams per day, plague or no plague. And the men whose entire profession was to manage that waste had either died, fled, or simply refused. The infrastructure holding civilization above its own filth was not dismantled by the plague. It was abandoned by the living. That was the world you would have walked into in 1349. Not just a plague, a collapse. The slow, steady, catastrophic unraveling of every system medieval Europe had built to keep itself one step above open sewage. And as you are about to discover, that step had never been very large to begin with. If you are new here, this channel is where comfortable myths go to die. Subscribe now, because we are only getting started. To understand what hygiene meant in 1349, you first need to understand what it meant in 1348, before the plague arrived, because the gap between those 2 years is the gap between a system barely functioning and a system that had ceased to function entirely. Medieval London ran on a logic that historians have charitably described as optimistic. The city had conduit systems piping water from springs at Tyburn through lead and timber pipes to cisterns in Cheapside. 12 of these systems served the city by the mid-14th century. Workers called water carriers delivered water door to door for a fee. There were rules, there were ordinances, there were inspectors, and underneath all of it, there were the cesspits. Every household in London that did not have direct access to the Thames, and many that did, relied on a cesspit, a stone-lined or wood-lined hole in the ground, and sometimes shared between neighboring households, sometimes not, always slowly filling. The regulations were specific. Cesspits had to sit at least 2.5 feet from a neighbor's property line, if stone-lined, 3.5 feet if they weren't. The men who cleaned them, the gong farmers, worked exclusively at night and were required to cart the waste to specific dumping sites outside the city walls. It was a system. A genuinely functional, if deeply unpleasant system. The problem that no cesspit regulation and no conduit system and no royal ordinance had ever managed to solve, was that the same rivers feeding the water supply were also receiving the output of those cesspits, the slaughterhouses, the tanneries, and the open drains running through every street. There was no separation between clean water and wastewater at any point in the chain. You were, in the most literal possible sense, drinking downstream from your own toilet. But in 1348, the gong farmers still showed up. The water carriers still made their rounds. The conduits still ran. The system, threadbare and leaking as it was, still held. In 1349, it didn't. Here is the thing most people get completely wrong about the Black Death and hygiene. The popular story is that medieval people were filthy, that their filth caused the plague, and that the plague was therefore a kind of inevitable consequence of a dirty civilization. That story is wrong on almost every count, and the reality is both more interesting and considerably more tragic. Medieval people were not universally filthy. This has been documented by historians including Ian Mortimer and Barbara Hannawalt, and the evidence is fairly unambiguous. Daily washing of hands and face was standard across social classes. Etiquette manuals from the period, and there were many of them, instructed readers to keep their fingernails clean, avoid touching their face with unwashed hands, and wipe their lips before drinking from a shared cup. Paris had 32 public bathhouses operating in the 13th century. Southwark, directly across the Thames from London, had 18 hot baths available for public use. Vienna had 29. Nuremberg had 14 and was considered one of the cleanest cities in Europe. Medieval people bathed. They cared about cleanliness. They built infrastructure around it. A 14th century Italian physician named Mino de Mineri catalogued 57 distinct methods of taking a bath, which is the kind of detail that suggests a civilization with strong opinions on the subject. The plague did not arrive because medieval Europeans were too dirty to survive. The plague arrived because they had no concept of what was actually making them sick, and in the absence of that knowledge, every system they had built, including the ones that were genuinely helpful, became useless. The Black Death entered Europe through Messina, Sicily in October of 1347. 12 Genoese trading ships docked in the harbor, and most of the sailors aboard were already dead. The living were covered in black swellings at the armpits and groin, buboes, oozing blood and pus, and the city of Messina expelled the ships almost immediately. It didn't matter. The plague was already ashore. By January of 1348, Genoa, Venice, and Marseille had fallen. Florence followed in March, Paris in June. By late summer, the plague had crossed the English Channel, arriving first at the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset, and reaching London by November. It moved faster than armies, faster than news, faster than any response could follow. By the time 1349 opened, the dying had been going on for months. And the specific horror of 1349, the year when the hygiene situation went from catastrophic to something for which the language of the period did not yet have adequate words, was not that the plague was killing people. It was that the dying had broken everything designed to contain the consequences of death. Consider what death at plague scale actually meant for sanitation. Thus, a body left unburied in the summer heat of 1349 became a public health crisis on its own terms within 24 hours, entirely apart from whatever had killed the person. Medieval cities had no refrigeration, no embalming, no hermetic sealing of any kind. A corpse in a London street in July was not a tragedy. It was a biological event. And in 1349, those biological events were happening at a rate of hundreds per day in London alone, with burial infrastructure designed to handle perhaps 20. A friar in the tiny French village of Givry kept meticulous death records throughout his career. In a normal year, he recorded 28 or 29 funerals. In 1349, he recorded 649 deaths, half of them in September alone. 649 in a village built to absorb fewer than 30 per year. In a village. Multiply that across every city, every town, every settlement in Europe. And you begin to understand what 1349 looked like from the ground. If this script is landing for you, do me a favor and hit like. It costs you nothing, and it tells the algorithm this kind of history is worth making. Now, back to the collapse. Pope Clement VI, sitting in Avignon, consecrated the entire Rhone River in 1349 so that bodies could be dumped directly into it with the church's blessing. The cemeteries were full. There was nowhere else to put the dead. Read that sentence again? The Pope consecrated a river so that it could serve as a mass grave. At its peak, Avignon was burying approximately 400 bodies per day. The city lost at least 6 cardinals in a single year. The Pope himself reportedly sat between 2 massive fires he ordered burned continuously in his chambers. Advice he had received from his personal physician, Guy de Chauliac, who had observed that the fires seemed to offer some protection. De Chauliac did not know why. He was right, incidentally. The heat almost certainly discouraged the fleas carrying Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the disease. But he had no mechanism for understanding that. He was doing something that worked for reasons he could not explain, surrounded by everything that wasn't working, unable to tell the difference. De Chauliac himself contracted the plague in 1349, surviving a continuous fever and a bubo in the groin. He wrote afterward with a devastation that still carries weight 7 centuries later, that physicians felt useless and ashamed, that they did not dare visit the sick for fear of infection, and that when they did visit them, they could do very little and accomplished nothing. This is the man considered one of the finest surgeons in 14th century Europe, and his honest assessment of the medical profession in 1349 was that it was effectively decorative. The medical framework in use in 1349 had 3 main pillars, and all 3 were wrong. The first was humoral theory, inherited from the ancient Greeks, which held that the body contained 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that illness represented an imbalance among them. Treatment meant restoring that balance. bloodletting to drain excess blood, purging to evacuate excess bile, induced vomiting when the situation demanded. Bloodletting was not a fringe practice. It was the standard of care. Doctors opened veins with the same confidence that a modern physician prescribes antibiotics. And the second framework was miasma theory, the belief that corrupt air rising from rotting matter, swamps, and unclean environments caused disease. This explains why people carried small bouquets of flowers pressed to their noses. You have seen those illustrations. Why homes were fumigated with burning herbs. Why small scented balls called pomanders were worn around the neck. The logic was not entirely irrational. Rotting things smell bad. Sick people smell bad. Places with bad smells consistently had more sick people. The conclusion that bad air caused disease followed directly from the observable evidence. It was completely wrong, but it was coherent. The third framework was theological. God was angry. The plague was punishment. Repentance was the cure. In October of 1348, in the medical faculty of the University of Paris, 49 of the finest physicians in Europe, the intellectual elite of the continent, produced an official report commissioned by King Philip VI of France, concluding that a triple conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the sign of Aquarius on March 20th, 1345, had corrupted the atmosphere and initiated the plague. This report was not a fringe opinion. It became the most widely circulated and authoritative medical explanation of the Black Death across the entirety of Europe. The people most at risk, according to these 49 experts, included those with too much exercise, too much sex, too much bathing, persistent worriers, and overweight individuals with a ruddy complexion. Too much bathing. The University of Paris's best medical minds had identified bathing as a risk factor for dying in a plague. They were advising the population of Europe to bathe less. In 1349, the specific machinery of plague medicine is worth understanding in some detail because it tells you exactly what you would have faced if you had fallen ill. Your doctor, assuming he had not already fled the city, which many did, would have arrived and assessed your symptoms. The characteristic buboes of bubonic plague, swollen lymph nodes at the armpit, groin, or neck, ranging from the size of an almond to the size of an orange, would have told him that your humors were corrupted and that the corrupt matter needed to be expelled. Treatment options in rough order of popularity: bloodletting, meaning he opens a vein in your arm and drains blood into a bowl until he judges the balance restored, lancing the bubo with a blade and cauterizing the wound with a hot iron. The Vicary method, which involved placing a live chicken's bare rump directly against the swollen bubo on the theory that the bird's heat would draw the poison out. Theriac, a compound of up to 80 ingredients including myrrh, cinnamon, and various opiates, considered a universal antidote since antiquity and available from apothecaries at considerable expense. 4 thieves' vinegar, prayer. None of it worked. None of it was designed to work against what was actually killing you. And in 1349, physicians were dying at the same rate as everyone else, which tells you everything about the protective value of their own treatments. One physician, Raymond Chalin de Vivario, he recognized explicitly that bloodletting was useless against the plague, wrote this down, committed it to paper, and then continued prescribing it anyway, noting in his own records that he reserved the treatment specifically for members of the Roman Curia whom he personally disliked. That is, by some measure, the most honest thing a physician has ever written in the history of medicine. Now, let us return to the hygiene infrastructure, because the medical failure and the sanitation failure were not parallel crises in 1349. They were the same crisis, feeding each other in a loop that nobody had the tools to interrupt. The gong farmers, the men who emptied the cesspits, worked for wages. When enough of them died or fled or simply refused, the cesspits stopped being emptied. I.e., cesspits that stopped being emptied overflowed into the streets, into the groundwater, into the wells that fed the conduit system that fed the drinking water supply. The slaughterhouses continued operating because people continued needing to eat, and the workers who remained continued dumping blood and offal into the Fleet River, which continued emptying into the Thames, which continued being the city's primary water source. The tanneries continued their chemical runoff. The latrines on both banks of the Fleet continued their contributions. King Edward III had written to the mayor of London in 1349, "This is a real letter, it survives," complaining, in language I am paraphrasing only slightly, that the streets were foul with human feces, and the air of the city was poisoned, to the great danger of anyone passing through, especially in a time of infectious disease. The King of England had to personally write to the mayor of his capital city to request that someone remove the human waste from the streets during a plague while people were dying in those streets. And the mayor's options were limited, because the people who would normally have done that work were either dead, ill, or had concluded, entirely rationally, that remaining in London in 1349 was a poor survival strategy. The infrastructure did not fail because medieval people were negligent. It failed because it had always been built on the assumption that most of the workforce would be alive. Florence, which lost between 50 and 80% of its population in the plague months of 1348 and into 1349, offers the clearest record of what total demographic collapse looked like from the inside. Giovanni Boccaccio, writing from Florence, described how the plague spread from the sick to the healthy through normal contact, even from touching clothing or objects, spreading like fire catching dry wood. He described brother abandoning brother, uncle abandoning nephew, parents abandoning their own children. He described, with the precision of a man who had watched it happen, how the dead lay in the streets until neighbors dragged them out, simply to get them away from their own doors. And in Siena, a man named Agnolo di Turra del Grasso left 5 words that have survived 7 centuries intact. He wrote, "I buried my 5 children with my own hands. No elaboration, no explanation, just the fact, standing alone on the page, because there was nothing to add." Siena's cathedral, may already under construction and intended to be the largest in Christendom, was simply abandoned mid-build when the workforce died. The stone walls that were meant to become transepts still stand, half-finished, attached to nothing. You can visit them. A construction project paused in 1349 that was never resumed because the civilization that had begun it was not the same civilization that survived it. The direct physical consequence of this scale of death for hygiene was something medieval cities had no precedent for managing. Bodies decompose. This is not a subtle process. A human body at summer temperatures in 1349, no refrigeration, no embalming, often lying where it fell, was, within 48 hours, a biological contamination event, producing gases, fluids, and pathogenic material at a rate that made the pre-plague cesspit situation look manageable by comparison. Mass graves were dug. The accounts are specific. Great pits piled deep with bodies, some so poorly covered that dogs dragged them out and devoured them in the streets. Agnolo di Turra wrote this. He was not being literary. He watched it happen to his own children. The consecration of the Rhone River by Pope Clement VI was not a spiritual gesture. It was a logistical solution to a problem for which no other solution existed. When you have run out of earth to bury people in and workers to dig it, a large moving body of water becomes your only option. The church provided the theological cover. The river provided the disposal. The smell of a European city in the summer of 1349 was not the ordinary medieval smell that contemporaries had long since stopped noticing. It was something different, something that chroniclers across multiple countries, writing independently, all describe with a specificity that makes clear they were not using rhetorical language. They were reporting what they experienced. And then, in one of the great dark ironies of European history, the plague did something that went beyond simply killing people. It destroyed the one practice that had, unknowingly, been helping: bathing. In the years and decades following the Black Death, the prevailing medical opinion shifted toward the view that warm water opened the pores of the skin and allowed disease to enter the body. The miasma theory, applied to hygiene, produced the conclusion that keeping the skin sealed, dry, unwashed, undisturbed, offered protection. The bathhouses that had been thriving social institutions across Europe for generations began to close, not because they had been proven dangerous, not because of evidence, because of fear, because people had watched half the population die and had concluded, in the absence of any accurate understanding of the mechanism, that somehow the baths were involved. The syphilis epidemic of the 1490s accelerated the collapse. By 1526, the philosopher Erasmus observed that the public baths, which had been at the height of fashion in the Low Countries just 25 years earlier, had completely vanished. Henry VIII ordered the Southwark stews closed in 1546. The historian Catherine Aschenberg documented what followed. Europeans became measurably less clean in the Renaissance and early modern period than they had been during the Middle Ages. The people who had survived the plague by abandoning hygiene infrastructure had transmitted that abandonment to their children and their children's children. The fear of disease made people more vulnerable to disease. The 17th century, not the 14th, turned out to be the true age of European filth. Something did come out of 1349 that was worth keeping. Venice, which had watched ships full of plague-carrying sailors destroy its population, developed the quarantine. The word itself comes from the Italian quarantina, at meaning 40 days, the period during which ships arriving from infected ports were required to anchor offshore before any passengers or cargo could come ashore. Dubrovnik passed the first formal quarantine law in 1377, requiring 30 days of mandatory isolation on a small island off the coast. Milan, under the Visconti family, went further and walled up entire houses with both the infected and the healthy sealed inside together. This was brutal. This was horrifying. It was also effective. Milan recorded only 15% mortality, while surrounding cities lost half their populations. These were the first gestures toward public health as a governmental responsibility. The idea that a city, a state, a sovereign, had a duty not merely to govern people but to protect them from disease. This idea did not exist before the Black Death. It emerged directly from the desperate, often cruel, sometimes effective responses to watching civilization nearly consume itself. Epidemiology, quarantine, the germ theory of disease that would eventually follow centuries later. All of it traces its origin to the moment European cities ran out of gravediggers and started consecrating rivers. In 1349, a man named Roger the Raker left London and was never recorded again. He left behind a city that was still generating waste at the full human rate, with half its waste management workforce dead or fled. He left behind cesspits overflowing into wells that fed conduits that delivered drinking water to the surviving population. Thus, he left behind a medical establishment prescribing bloodletting and live chickens and planetary realignment as treatments for a bacterium that would not be identified for another 5 centuries. He probably did the right thing. The world he left behind would, in the following years, slowly, painfully rebuild. Not because anyone understood what had happened, not because the medicine improved, or the water infrastructure was finally separated from the sewage infrastructure, or the miasma theory was abandoned. None of that happened yet. The world rebuilt because enough people survived to begin rebuilding, and because catastrophe, at sufficient scale, eventually forces adaptation, even without understanding. But in 1349, you didn't have the benefit of knowing that. In 1349, you had a cesspit that hadn't been emptied in 3 months, and water from a river that had been receiving plague-dead bodies since spring. A doctor who believed the alignment of Mars had unbalanced your humors, and somewhere between 1/3 and 2/3 of everyone you had ever known already dead or dying. Your clothing was stored above a shaft of human excrement to keep the fleas away. The man who was supposed to clean the shaft had walked north and disappeared, and that counted as the infrastructure of civilization, which tells you everything you need to know about 1349, and about how thin, in any era, the line between order and collapse has always been. If you made it to the end of this, you are exactly the kind of person this channel is built for. Subscribe if you haven't already. New scripts drop regularly, and they only get darker from here.